Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We hear a lot of loose talk these days about all the things that are supposed to unite us as Americans. But there are far more important and powerful forces that divide us. At the center of that divide is the subject of class. Even more than race, the class divide lies at the base of the chasm that separates what John Edwards once called two Americas. The symbols are everywhere. Starbucks America versus Dunkin' Donuts America, educated versus non-educated, Walmart versus Whole Foods. But these are just symbols for the latest manifestations of a long history of class conflict in America. How they're playing out today is reflected in my guest Sarah Smarsh's new memoir, Heartland. Sarah Smarsh has written extensively about class and the working poor. Her articles have been published in Harper's, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and numerous other publications. She was recently a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media and Public Policy, and it is my pleasure to welcome Sarah Smarsh here to talk about her memoir, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Great to have you here. First of all, tell us a little bit about where you grew up in Kansas.
Sure. I grew up on a cattle and wheat farm about 30 miles west of Wichita, so that's south central Kansas, not too far north of the Oklahoma border. I had red dirt on my shoes when I was a kid, and it was a small working farm. I'm a fifth-generation Kansas wheat farmer, and it was an American experience that's increasingly rare due to forces that I talk about in my book in terms of agriculture and rural life, but it was beautiful in a lot of ways, too.
To what extent were you aware of this being rural and different from other parts of America? And at what point did you begin to realize that there was that distinction?
That's such a good question, and I think it has a lot to do with the moment I grew up. So I was a child in the 80s and a teenager in the 90s, and while there were some technological shifts going on already at that time, due to the technologies of my class that were available to us in terms of just economic feasibility. We didn't have cable TV. We didn't have the internet. There was no computer in my home, even as I graduated from high school in 1998. And so I was really, my experience on that farm in terms of relationship to media and the narratives that might have told me what my place was in some pecking order were sort of more like a 1950s childhood than maybe like a 2000s childhood. So for that reason, to finally answer your question, I don't think I knew much about our station in the world. I certainly didn't think of myself as poor. It was when I got to college. I was a first-generation college student at the University of Kansas, is where I first began to understand, I was going to class with kids who, they got a new car for high school graduation largely middle-class kids, but nonetheless supported by their parents who had been able to save for their college funds and so on. And meanwhile, I was working 3 jobs, and I had scholarships too, but those were some of the hardest years of my life. And for a lot of the kids that I hung out with, it was like the funnest years of their life. And so that told me there was something different about where I came from.
One of the things you talk about with respect to class, and it's sort of an interesting dichotomy that comes across, is that on the one hand, it is an artificial construct. It is kind of an illusion. But on the other, it is very real with very real and very serious consequences.
Yeah, that's for sure. And like you mentioned, some of the other identity factors and demographics that sort of shape our experiences as Americans in your intro, including race. And so like race, I think class is this thing that we've sort of socially constructed to divide one another. And yet it has, everything to do with our ultimate life experience in this society. So it can be, therein lies some of the challenge of addressing it, is that, somehow those of us who are fighting against those sorts of categorizations or power strata are doing so within the context of a society that has accepted and been complicit in those same social constructs for a long time. And then often, adding to the complicating that challenge is that often those who are have the wisdom and tenacity to fight against, say, racial disparities are people on the losing end of that spectrum, and so too class and gender. I would say it tends to be people who grew up with some economic strife who are most compelled to fight to change the social order of things economically, and women are the ones leading the battle about gender, and so it can feel like an uphill battle to attempt these kind of social correctives.
How much of it, in your view, is purely economic, and how much of it is sign of the cultural normative aspects of growing up in a particular place?
Yeah, that's such a good question. A kind of buzzword or popular term in media discourse today is the urban-rural divide, and I feel very reluctant to use terms like that because I think it suggests that we're almost two different types of people or two different kinds of beings, and that does have some parallels with some of the dangerous ways that people use things like race and gender to categorize. I have lived on both sides of that so-called divide, and yet I am the same person, and so I know that it's. I know because of my first-hand experience of those, yes, very different cultures and experiences, but nonetheless shared human experiences. And I think that yes, the aspects of my day-to-day life were shaped by, and you're asking about class, and I'm kind of honing specifically in on the place component of my class, which was rural America. But regardless, whether it's a poor neighborhood in an inner city or a geographically remote area in Montana, I think that the experience of having to struggle economically day to day, I do think is a more powerful factor in shaping outcomes and just the fabric of your daily existence than any, the particular culture of a place. And I say that because, within the context of, say, the middle or upper middle classes, there's, of course, immense diversity of cultural experience. And yet they share an ability to call a cab to the airport or go on a vacation a couple times a year. Or, my family had, literally knew no one who wasn't fighting in the financial battle. And so it does seem to me that somehow in a capitalist society overrides, just the culture of place and so on, and just carving out what your life's going to look like. I wanted to add to that to clarify. I'm talking about just the how class is shaped. I wrote this story as a white woman, and I was careful along the way to always be reverent to the other aspects of American identity that class intersects with and that also shape it. And so I'm absolutely not talking in any sort of superlatives about class is more important than race or gender or sexual orientation or religion and so on. What I'm talking about right now is just the fact that among poor, I feel like in many ways poor people of all different backgrounds have more in common. They might not think they do, and political messaging might successfully leverage the idea that they're very different. But in fact, I think they have much more in common in just the fabric of their daily lives than say, a poor white person has with a rich white person.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because in terms of political messaging, I think that political consultants would argue that class is a more important factor, that class divides even transcend race and gender at this point.
Yeah, I push back against that. I'm not a researcher, and I did consult research and statistics in the crafting of this book. From where I stand and my understanding, having many conversations about class, specifically as a woman, I feel like it's dangerous and kind of a losing game to really be to create some sort of order of maladies. It's just, there's no way. Life in America is inevitably intricately wound up with other people's lives and realities, and race and gender and all of these things are part of class, regardless of your own place and upbringing. So that's not how I look at it, but I know that people come at it a lot of different ways. Now, I will say that I do think it is important when I talk about things like diversity. I always want to add to that conversation, let's also specifically name socioeconomic class. So even as class and race and gender are, intersect with one another, I believe that class deserves to be discussed and examined in its own right, just as do race and gender, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. One of the things you talk about, too, and this relates to kind of cultural norms, and as well as the economic consequences, and you talk a lot about teenage mothers and having women that have children really early. Talk a little bit about that and how you see that playing out in this broader context.
Sure. So at the beginning of our chat, I mentioned I'm a fifth-generation wheat farmer. That's on my paternal side. On my mother's side, I am, as far back as I can trace in the maternal lineage, the descendant of generations and generations of teen pregnancy. So, that really informed how I structured the book and thought about the book in a lot of ways, because it's a story about my relationship to class and the environment that I was born into, and that was one in which at a very young age I became aware of how important it would be in my life to ensure that I myself did not continue that family cycle if I wanted to go out and do the things and accomplish the goals that I hoped for in the world. So this, that's just kind of another aspect of now teen pregnancy that has its correlations with poverty, and that crosses all sorts of racial lines and geographic lines, and even in a global sense. For me, it was a story about farmers in Kansas, and it absolutely is a culture where women have babies much younger than they do in very cosmopolitan places like New York City, and that's not necessarily a bad thing by any means. In my particular family, it did create some severe challenges for women who were already strapped financially, particularly in decades when they didn't have much agency on their own in an economy that favored men's wages and employment. And so often those early pregnancies resulted in dependency on men, often unsavory ones. And so it's sort of like, being a parent is expensive. If you're already in the hole, then it's obvious that is going to have economic repercussions.
When did you realize that wasn't something you wanted to have happen to you, and how did you come to that?
I honestly, even before I think probably I was even old enough to bear children, I was very aware of this as a feature of our family. I think just because being around my friends, my mom was 17 when she got pregnant with me, and she also had like what they call here good genes, to where she looked incredibly young, even when say she was in her mid-20s, she still could have passed as a teenager. So I'm hanging out with my friends, and literally my mom would appear more like my sister, and my grandmother, who was 34 when she became a grandma, more like my mother. And so I think probably just because of the contrast with my friends' families that I saw, I understood that there was something very different about us in that way, which I should point out, because your listeners might be saying, well, I thought she just said everybody has kids young there. Well, the difference in our family, which I try to kind of parse in the book, it's one thing to go off to like a state school and then come back to your small town with your college sweetheart and get married and have your first child at 23. That's a pretty natural order of things. For my family, the teenage pregnancy and the not finishing of high school, often because of that, was the sort of class marker within the rural strata that we were living at. So yeah, I realized, honestly, when I was a child, that it was going to be important that I didn't get pregnant before I finished high school, and that's something I talk about in the book in a very intimate way. It's one of those things that, these cycles that had to do with economics and bigger forces that shaped our family life were absolutely informing and shaping my most private and intimate thoughts and experiences.
And the subset of that is education and understanding the importance of education as a way out. Talk about that.
Yeah, so my family, it's a bunch of really brilliant people, honestly, and whatever way with words I might have that led me to be a writer, it comes from them. They're, this witty, storytelling, vibrant bunch. They just, they didn't have the same opportunities that I ended up with. Mine came through public education, which was the only institution I was possibly going to be accessing from our socioeconomic lot. And so I was a bookish kid and a goal-oriented kid and a kind of serious kid, to be honest. So I understood, just as I knew I ought not get pregnant, I knew too, if I want different outcomes, here's another thing I'm going to make sure that I need to do different than the women before me, is make sure I finish high school. And so, I studied hard. By that time, I'm a teenager in the 90s, and by that decade, post-Title IX, young women are being told, you deserve to go to college and be an engineer if you want to. And I just was encouraged to go to college by public high school teachers, and I applied for scholarships and got them, and thus the course of my life was forever different than that of the women before me. And so the education piece is really important to me. And, I'm a staunch defender of public education. I also, though, am always careful to point out, it pains me when the national conversation talks about the educated and the uneducated, because I think implicit in that is often a criticism of the latter, as though they are ignorant, dumb, lesser than. And in fact, their education has come by other means, life experiences. Yes, they're lacking in formal degrees, and you know what? They might have done just fine in those academic spaces if given the chance. So education, I think, when you're talking about earlier all the ways that class, is just baked into our culture, one of the first ways that we divide ourselves up is around age 18. Where are you going? Are you going off to a campus where you're going to have 2 or 4 years to sit in a classroom and think about things and examine ideas and get new information, or are you going to go off to a factory floor or a field? That moment, that line, is certainly one of the most dramatic in our society, I think.
And one of the things that it's about, and you touch on it when you talk about sitting in the classroom, and you touch on it in Heartland, is time for, or not time for, self-reflection.
Yeah, when I endeavored to piece together this book, which really took some doing in reconstructing family history, because poverty doesn't leave much of a paper trail, and people don't have time to do things like keep lovely journals and save letters. And nonetheless, I did find some troves, but it was it was a difficult task to just figure out where we came from, in large part because, as you just suggested, the experience of poverty and the working poor is, you just by necessity always have to have your eyes pointed forward. You're looking at the next task, the next bill, the next chore, the next job application, the next, it's just the grind of that. It's not to suggest that people of all classes aren't incredibly busy and overwhelmed, but it's a different overwhelm in that it has to do with just scraping by to survive. And so if you want a moment to take a breath, that is not available as an option. And for that reason, in addition to probably the culture I come from, which is German, Catholic, rural farmers, is a very stoic place, not a lot of crying and hugging going on, deep love certainly, but a very severe sometimes and austere kind of emotional default. So for that reason, when I'm asking my family to reflect on the things that happened and reconstruct these memories and how did you feel at this challenging juncture and so on, it honestly, not only was it the first time that anyone else cared to ask, I don't think they had necessarily even asked the questions themselves. There's no therapy where I come from. Nobody could afford it. Nobody would have time to do it. And so that's one of the reasons probably that the book took so many years to write. Those are some thick walls to knock down.
Did you have a sense at some point that this was a world that you wanted to escape from?
I didn't. People ask me the question, how did you get out? And this is a phrase that we use, get out. She got out. How did he get out? You need to be sure to get out. I always loved my home. I always loved my family, and I have always felt deeply rooted in the place that I come from. Now I've lived in places like New York and Kansas City and Austin over the years, but I always go back to the place I was raised, and that is where I live now. And so, it's really just to do the things that I wanted to do professionally. It was that necessitated that I go to places like New York City, and that was lovely too. I love New York, but I never. What I wanted to escape was these cyclical aspects of poverty: the teen pregnancy, the lack of access to formal education, the having no savings, the grind of the daily struggle to survive. I wanted out of that. But that's not a place, and that's not a family and a culture. That's just an economic reality. So I wanted to get out of that. But somehow I wanted to simultaneously stay in my place and be responsible to my family, and even have a sense of kind of civic responsibility to my state and to its progress. And all of those things, to my mind, require being grounded physically in that place. So it's kind of the way I think that our realities and the way that we experience a place there's so many aspects to it, and we, in a kind of 21st century digital, globalized moment, sort of overlook the importance of just raw geography in our day-to-day lives, sensing ourselves as somehow kind of like a post-place society. I wanted to get out of poverty, but I didn't want to get out of southern Kansas.
Did you want to break the cycle for others? You talk about wanting to sort of break this cycle for yourself, but was there a sense of larger obligation to get others in the community to, if not do exactly what you had done, to break that cycle of poverty or children at an early age?
When I was a kid, I don't think I sensed it at that level. I did, however, the way that I sensed some, desire outside of my own experience was just unto my family. I always, as a kid, dreamed of, reaching some point where I could then help my family too, so that they could actually retire and have a relaxing day and not a day on a construction site. I think that later in my career, and I was a professor for about 5 years, where I was, often having relationships and friendships and being an educator of Kansas kids, some of whom came from places similar to mine. I did feel a sense of just because of the particular vantage that I had, I would say rare among college professors, just as I'm rare among national media members to come from the place I do. I did sort of feel like, wanting to use that position to somehow look out for kids who I knew might be like too proud to say that they didn't know the words that someone was using about the college experience because their families hadn't used those words. And so that's not quite the same thing as you're talking about as like a grand mission statement to save other people. But I do absolutely always feel a responsibility to others in that, we think of class and we talk about class with this metaphor of a ladder, where are you on the social ladder, and that suggests that something that I have done involves moving upward. I would argue that ultimately we all kind of hold simultaneous narratives and experiences, but whatever's true about that, about my upward mobility, I want to always be, having an arm outreached to help other people up.
Sarah Smarsh, her book is Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. It's just out from Scribner. Sarah, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
This was great. Thanks for the opportunity, Jeff.
Thank you.